Well, let me begin by just making a sort of demographic fact. And this varies from country to country, culture to culture. But many, many people who start in one particular expression of Christian faith change over time. They may start in a Pentecostal setting and end up in a Reformed Protestant setting, or vice versa. They may start off Catholic, end up evangelical. So people go through changes in their lives. When they go through changes, they question things they were told, and they find out whether their community can accept them once first when they're asking the questions, and second if they reach a different conclusion.
Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. Today, our guest is no stranger. We've had him before, Brian McLaren. Welcome back to Conversations with Pastor Cliff.
Pastor Cliff, I'm so glad to be back with you.
Thank you. I mean, you came as one of our favorites, and I saw it fitting to invite you back to talk about your two books, Do I Stay Christian and Faith After Doubt. So that's pretty much our topic for today. Brian, I know many people don't necessarily know who you are. Some of them may have seen you in the last interview that we did together, but just a brief, a bio as to who you are and what has got you involved in this work that you are doing to this day.
Sure. Well, first I should say I live in the United States in the South, in the state of Florida, right near the Gulf of Mexico. I have a deep connection to South Africa. My grandparents lived there for a period of time. So, and I've visited there and have great memories of those visits. I started my career as a college English teacher. I loved literature, and I also taught English as a second language. And along the way, I became a pastor and helped start a new congregation. I served at that congregation for 24 years. During that time, I started writing books. And so for the last 18 years, I've worked as a writer and public speaker. I have a number of activist causes that I'm committed to. And for the last few years, I've been working closely with the Center for Action and Contemplation based here in the United States, which is a beautiful network of people brought together by a Franciscan priest named Richard Rohr.
I see. I think I've heard about Richard Rohr at some point. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And Brian, tell me, these books are fascinating that you have penned. Do I Stay Christian and Faith After Doubt? And the topics, the titles of the books themselves are very gripping. So, what actually inspired you to write, these two books?
Yes.
Some personal experiences that kind of prompted you to actually write these books.
Yes. So, Cliff, something that South Africa and the United States have in common is a history where the Christian faith was used to justify apartheid and what we called segregation, but it was the same thing as apartheid. And in our history, the brutal history of slavery, and sadly, heartbreakingly, we're seeing a resurgence of what some people call white Christian nationalism, which is a form of white supremacy, and seeing the way that the Bible was used and the Christian faith was used to justify harm against other people in our history has made many people deeply suspicious. In other words, we grew up in the Christian faith. We experienced many good things from that upbringing, but maybe we experienced a few difficult or harmful things from our faith. And that makes us then look into our history, and then we develop deep questions about the Christian faith. And so these two books, Faith After Doubt and Do I Stay Christian, are two ways I've tried to be helpful to people going through that re-examination process. Faith After Doubt helps people understand faith not just as one thing, but as a growing process. And many people, they come to realize they don't need to reject their faith. They just need to grow from one stage of their faith to another stage. And then Do I Stay Christian goes a little deeper and really examines the historical and really present current reasons why many people feel they need to leave their faith, looks at reasons to stay, and then tries to help people decide how they want to live, whether they go or stay.
Uh-huh. That's interesting, Brian, because I mean, in our last conversation, we spoke about, the 4 stages of faith, as we spoke
Yes.
about. And tell me now, in this book, do I stay Christian? You tackle some of the gripping questions that many individuals may face about their faith journeys. What do
Yes.
you believe are common reasons that people, find themselves asking themselves these questions about how, do they remain Christian, and how do you provide that guidance for them to navigate through these uncertainties they may be
Yes.
confronting? Yeah.
So the way I structured this book, Do I Stay Christian, is by the first 10 chapters. I look at 10 of the most compelling reasons why people leave Christian faith. Now, I'll be honest, some of these are things that I felt and I've struggled with. Others are things that are reasons that other people have brought to me through my years as a pastor. And I should also add, people would be surprised how many clergy themselves reach a point where they begin to maybe not question on the deepest level their relationship with God, although some do, but very often questioning the kind of machinery and institutional expressions of Christian faith. So the first third of the book, I basically are all around the answer no, and I try to give the most honest and fair and full expression of those 10 reasons that I possibly can. Then in the second part of the book, I basically say, look, could you have your eyes open to those first 10 reasons and find a reason to stay Christian? And so the next 10 chapters explore ways that people say yes. It was important to me, as a matter of honesty, that in no way in those second 10 chapters did I minimize the issues brought up in the first 10. In other words, in no way do I want to say, oh, that third reason why people say no isn't that big a deal. I think they're all a big deal. Um, but are there ways that people can say yes? And that's what we did in the second three. And at the end of that, as I was writing, I realized, there are some people who need to say no to staying Christian, at least in the short term, because they have been so deeply wounded or damaged by the Christian faith, by ministers, priests, and so on. And they just need to get some distance. Any of us who work with people who've been victims of domestic abuse, we know the first thing we need to do is get them out of the abusive situation. So in the third part of the book, what I wanted to do is help people say, whether you stay or leave Christian faith, you have to wake up tomorrow and ask, well, what kind of person do I want to be? How do I want to live? And so that was my focus for that last part of the book.
Uh-huh. That's kind of helpful, Brian. Um, Now, in Faith After Doubt, you delve into the concept of, doubt itself within a Christian context or a faith
Yes.
context. So can you elaborate on why, this doubt concept that you bring about is an essential aspect of, of being, in a healthy spiritual journey, and how
Yes.
does your kind of encourage, readers to embrace doubt rather than fear it?
Yes. Yes. Well, let me begin by just making a sort of demographic fact. And this varies from country to country, culture to culture. But many, many people who start in one particular expression of Christian faith change over time. They may start in a Pentecostal setting and end up in a Reformed Protestant setting, or vice versa. They may start off Catholic, end up evangelical. So people go through changes in their lives. When they go through changes, they question things they were told, and they find out whether their community can accept them once, first when they're asking the questions, and second if they reach a different conclusion. um, Let me give you an example that a lot of people don't even know about. uh, Through for hundreds and hundreds of years in Christian history, Christians across Europe and the Middle East and North Africa believed in something called relics. There might have been a martyr or a saint who died, and someone cut off a finger or a lock of hair or an ear. And to us today, this sounds grotesque and incredible and superstitious, but there were hundreds of years where people, the highlight of their life was not traveling to see the Eiffel Tower in Paris, but to see the little finger of this saint, that was supposedly in a church somewhere. Well, if you lived in those times and you were to question whether that was legitimate and important, people would have thought you were crazy. Everybody knows that if you can get near to a relic, as they were called, that this increases your holiness and your devotion and your spirituality. Well, many of us today would say, come on, that sounds silly. I would never do that. That's not the way I orient my Christian faith. So, in a real sense, we believe the way we do because people doubted things that were very, very important to them spiritually in past times. One other quick example: a lot of people know in Christian history there was a period of witch burning, and as you may know, there have been kind of resurgences of versions of that in Africa in recent decades. Uh, I worry that there will be resurgences of that in different forms in the United States, because we have similar kinds of dynamics going on, where certain people are scapegoated and vilified, and other people think they're doing God a favor by persecuting them or maybe even killing them. Um, well, all I can say is I'm so grateful that people had the courage to doubt those practices of the Christian faith so that they weren't carried on. So, in that way, every one of us has inherited a version of faith that required our ancestors to doubt things that their peers believed.
Uh-huh. But you touch on something quite profound, Brian, because a lot of our religious institutions, pride themselves on certainty, and uh,
Yeah.
putting this certainty towards members within their communities. But your book seemed to speak on a broader cultural shift where these traditional religious structures are being questioned or reevaluated. So how do you your work, in contributing towards this,
Yeah.
conversation, and what changes do you hope you can inspire these religious communities in terms of, moving to that doubt, as you talk about, instead of, hinging or hanging on to certainty?
Yes. Well, one of the unfortunate consequences of people having an all or nothing approach, either you believe everything our church says, either you believe everything I as a preacher say, or you are kicked out and excommunicated and maybe even damned by God, right? So there's this all or nothing thinking that is very attractive to a certain kind of authoritarian leader, and a certain kind of dependent personality, that they're willing to do anything to be accepted by this pastor or prophet or apostle or this denomination or congregation. Um, the problem is when you're given an all or nothing certainty approach at the beginning, if you question it, then very often you're given no choice but to throw it all away. And so people go from being hardcore believers in this one very rigid, high control group and system of belief to then being just suspicious and skeptical of everything.
Mhm.
Well, one of the things that I hope we can do is that we can help people not respond to an all or nothing mindset with that was associated with faith and spirituality to a nothing mindset that rejects everything. I think there are ways for us to try that. Well, let me say it this way: to be grown-ups, we learn to love and respect our parents for all they did for us. But we also learn to acknowledge that even though our parents did their best, they had flaws. They didn't know everything. They weren't perfect. And something happens to us as parents and grandparents when we realize, oh, I wish I had been behaved differently as a parent to my child because I see how that behavior on my part has wounded them. So we learn to grow, and that's what I hope people can understand. Christian faith was never meant to be a destination where you achieve full certainty about all truth at the age of 23 and you never grow anymore. You just defend your perfection at that point. That creates arrogance, that creates harm. We need a humble approach that keeps us learning and growing through all of our lives.
Yeah, I think you touched on something quite crucial, that we never quite arrive, as you put it,
Yeah.
but we are forever in this process of growth. And you pointed out in your book, "Do I Stay Christian?" Because you suggest that doubt can be this catalyst for a deeper
Yes.
spiritual growth. So, can you share some of the examples, perhaps, or anecdotes from your own life or other people's lives that
Yes.
can illustrate this transformative power of doubt?
Well, let me use an example that goes to the heart of the racial realities in our two countries. My grandfather was a missionary from Europe, from Scotland, and was in Central Africa or in Angola. And he had been trained to believe in white supremacy as a Christian doctrine. He was a true believer in white supremacy. And I had an experience when I was about 12 years old. My grandfather was in the United States, and it was the weekend in April of that year when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot and killed, murdered. Uh, and uh, I we took my grandfather out to dinner, and I won't go into all the details, but he said disparaging things about Dr. King, similar to things that were said about many people in South Africa. He called him a communist, and he said other things that I won't even repeat. And I remember my parents respected Dr. King. In fact, my I lived near Washington D.C. My parents took my brother and me down so that we could witness one of the demonstrations because they felt that this was an important breakthrough and growth for our country to get rid of our racist past and to try to move beyond it. And I remember that day, I realized I love my grandfather. I respect him. He is a man of God in many ways, but he is also a man. He's a human who inherited certain prejudices. And I needed the permission to say, I don't agree with my grandfather about this. I think he's deeply, deeply wrong about this. And that was difficult for me because many people they have they've inherited either or thinking he's either all good or all bad. But it was part of my growth, and I think all of us reach this point. To be a loving human being, we need to be able to acknowledge that people are a mixture of wisdom and ignorance, of virtue and weak blind spots, and so on. So that to me has happened in 1,000 different ways, but that was one of the very dramatic ones where I remember in my own mind, I just said, I love my grandfather. I respect him. I think he is so wrong about this.
Okay, that's kind of helpful, Brian. How you explain it, because many of us get to this point in our lives where we have these nuances, in terms of how we navigate our lives in the spiritual in our spiritual journeys, and we did
Yes.
touch on it in our last conversation, on the whole stages of faith. But now, in Faith After Doubt, you seem to offer this roadmap, for those who are navigating a crisis, in faith.
Yes.
Um, could you probably outline some of the practical
Sure.
steps or insights that one can glean from your book?
Mm.
It can help them navigate through the doubts that kind of emerge as they go through about their journey with a stronger and more, towards that more authentic faith, as if we could call it that.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
Yes, yes. So one of the things I'd encourage people to do is to first step back and you're concerned about your own situation, your own relationship to your parents and your church and your pastor and your denomination and so on. But I'd invite you to step back and just think about a person in general. Every child is born into a family, and the child doesn't know what's right or wrong. They don't know what's safe or dangerous. And so they depend on parents to teach them simple rules. You can do this, you cannot do this. You can eat this, you cannot eat that. You can go and play here, you cannot go and play there. And this stage I call simplicity. Every child born uh, virtually every child born is born into a situation of simplicity where their parents and other authority figures say, yes, you can do this. No, you cannot do that. That's simplicity. I call that dualism because the whole world is put into two categories: safe, dangerous, right, wrong, us, them, permitted, forbidden, um, frowned upon, encouraged, and a huge part of our childhood. It means learning those rules. And whatever your religion, Christian, Muslim, even if you're atheist, your parents tell you, there are things you should believe and things you should not believe. Uh, Many people stay in simplicity their whole lives. They learn from their parents and then they become parents and they teach their children. And many people, that's where they are their whole lives. More and more people at a younger and younger age move from simplicity to a second stage that I call complexity. And then more and more people, many people stay in complexity their whole lives. They learn to that there are shades of gray between black and white. They learn they can do a good thing for not so good a reason. They learn that different cultures and even different denominations within the Christian faith define the dualism in different ways. And so you get some gray edges and some gradations. So life becomes more complex. Many people stay at that second stage of complexity their whole lives. And then I think growing numbers of people at a younger and younger age are moving from stage 2 complexity to stage 3 I call perplexity, where they ask deeper questions than they've ever asked before. And many people stay in stage 3 the rest of their lives. But I think more and more people are moving from stage 3 to what I would call stage 4, that I call harmony or solidarity. And one of our great challenges, and it's really one of the things that podcasts like yours, I think, help people do. But one of our great challenges is that we don't have many churches that help people who move out of stage 1. And so we need, I think, spiritual leaders and guides to help us keep going through that process.
Yeah, I think it's important that you mention a very important point, Brian, because many of our faith leaders, many of them are stuck in stage 1 kind of process
Yes.
of faith, and they teaching whether it be kids or even adults that they also teach them to remain in stage 1 of their faith, but they have a
Yes.
crisis if these kids go out to college or university and they start learning about critical thinking, and they start to ask a whole lot of pressing questions, and they find themselves moving to a stage 2, as you explained, and also to a stage 3. And a lot of churches don't actually cater for that, and they kind of see that as a threat. In my own experience, when people start to ask those type of questions that are very pressing, because essentially I think, and I don't know what you think, it's pretty much how the Bible has been presented to people as
Yeah.
this checklist of all the answers, that like a guidebook, and we all know it's a lot more complicated than that. But I don't
Yes.
know, what is your take on that? Yeah.
Yes. Well, the Bible is such an interesting resource, because when I was brought up in a stage one way, I was taught that the Bible was a stage one book. You could say it like this. Um, uh, People can only see what they have the ability to see at that point in their maturity. And so when people in stage one read the Bible, all they see is what stage one people are able to see. They see everything in terms of right or wrong and so on. There's a lot of other things going on in the Bible, but they can't see it, so they can't teach it. But what happened to me is, for example, I remember I grew up in a denomination that said men can lead and women must be silent. They cannot lead. But then I started to see things in the Bible that said that. And I saw things in the Bible that gave women a lot more permission. For example, the story of Mary and Martha, where Martha wants to sit at Jesus' feet like the disciples and not just do work in the kitchen like her sister Mary. And Jesus defends her. So you start to realize, oh, that's when complexity takes in. And now with complexity, you see more and more. You get to stage 3, perplexity, and you discover a book like the book of Job. Job is so interesting in the Bible because Job's friends are quoting ideas from Leviticus and Deuteronomy and conventional understandings that they get from the Bible. But in the book of Job, God tells Job's friends that they have not spoken truly and accurately, that Job actually, with his questions, has been more pleasing to God than these guys with their answers, where they were quoting certain parts of the Bible. Or for all Christians, in the Bible, circumcision, for example, is an absolute requirement in the Hebrew Scriptures. And then Paul comes along in the New Testament and says, yeah, it's not really that important. So in the Bible, you can be brought from stage 1 to stage 2, and you can even be brought to stage 3, because now deep questions are, why do the rules change? How do we reconcile that Leviticus says this, and that or Proverbs says this, and Job or Ecclesiastes says that, and then how do we put all that together? And maybe Pastor Cliff, I could just say it like this: I think in the Bible we have the patriarchs and the law that represent simplicity. Then we have the wisdom literature and the prophets that take us into complexity. And then we have other parts of the wisdom literature and the prophets that take us into perplexity, where old ideas are challenged. And then we have Jesus and in the New Testament that takes us to say that love is the most important thing. And that's, to me, is the place of harmony. So I think the Bible itself is like a library that brings us in that direction.
It's amazing that you put it that way, because a lot of people don't think of the Bible as this, library with diverse, perspectives that kind of challenge, previous generations' perspectives on how they viewed the world. And also these people were shaped by, different contexts. So you have this intersectionality of, different contexts, different answers that emerge. So you have this spectrum of ideas about, what God is doing in the world. And those may not necessarily look entirely the same as the previous generation.
Could I give you 2 quick examples of that?
Of course.
The first one that struck me when I was a pastor and I was preaching multiple times a week and I was reading the Bible constantly to prepare for sermons and so on. I remember someone pointed out to me, they asked me, what is the biblical attitude toward the monarchy in the Hebrew Scriptures? The monarchy meaning when there was a king. And I could find verses that said having a king was great, and I could find verses that said having a king was horrible.
Yeah.
And this person said to me, well, what if the Bible contains an argument about having a king? And that if you only say having a king is great, you miss part of the story. And if you only say having a king is terrible, you miss part of the story. Maybe the wisdom of the Bible is preserved in the argument and the dynamic tension between those who are critical of monarchy and those who are accepting of it. And I just remember it blew my mind when I heard that, because suddenly so many things in the Bible, I could see a dynamic tension. And then one other quick example. in the Sermon on the Mount, which I just think should be so important to all of us who call ourselves Christians, Jesus' most concentrated teaching that we have, he says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And he takes a traditional teaching, but then I think he gives us the key to, he's not just contradicting what he said in what was said in the Hebrew scriptures. He says, "I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." And I think what he meant by this is the law was taking us in a certain direction, but it didn't take us the whole way there. I'm coming to fulfill the intention of the writers and wise people of the past. I'm coming to take us the next steps in the journey. It's not a contradiction, it's a fulfillment. And there are so many examples of this in life. We don't get where we need to go in one step. We need multiple steps.
Definitely. I mean, definitely. I concur with that, Brian. Now, tell me, after giving those, great examples of what we're talking about, you address a lot of intersections in your book within contemporary issues such as social justice and environmental stewardship. And
Yes.
how do you see these reflected in Do I Stay Christian and Faith After Doubt? And also, why do you think it's important for us to discuss, to have a discussion of faith to engage in these pressing social issues that we
Yes.
may be confronted with? Yeah.
Well, let me give you one that is of great importance to me, and I think to so many of us, and that is the issue of how we live with the earth. Now, what's very, very interesting is if you read the Hebrew scriptures, there are all these passages in the book of Leviticus, for example, that are about caring for the earth, letting the fields go fallow. Sabbath is not just for human beings, human workers, it's for your cattle and your animals too. They're given a rest too. There's this concern for the earth and for our fellow creatures, right? But over the last 500 years, living in an industrial exploitive age, if you ask people, what does the Bible say about our relationship to the earth? They would quote one verse in Genesis and they would say, we have dominion over the earth. And you can see this was a shortcut and it told us what we wanted to hear. We had powerful people who wanted to make money by exploiting the earth, even destroying parts of the earth, but they would make money. And so they loved that verse that they could quote. But now we're realizing there was so much more wisdom than just, I would say, not just using that verse, but abusing that verse to legitimize destruction of the earth. And so you can take issue after issue. And when people pull one verse from the Bible and act as if that ends the discussion, well, here's what I found. And I can't think of an example where that way of using the Bible doesn't lead to harm in some way. Because life is often so much more complicated than just plastering stealing one verse out of its context and using it like a sword to say, accept what I'm saying or you're wrong.
Yeah, um, that's interesting, and a lot of us tend to do that, and a lot of Christians tend to do that to
Yes.
try and piece out text probably out of context to try and settle a score. But we in your work, I find that you are coming up with something that is more helpful, more productive in terms of how we engage with Scripture and how we actually see all these nuances actually playing or intersecting together. So in your book, for example, Do I Stay Christian and After Doubt, you seem to to emphasize the importance of community and
Yes.
dialogue in a process where we wrestle with these questions of faith that we may find ourselves asking. How do you envision, see these books used within religious communities and different groups, for example, and what outcome do you hope will
Yes.
engage in this process where believers or groups find themselves having these dialogues in these communities?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, a metaphor comes to my mind, Pastor Cliff. A friend of mine said, imagine that you grew up in a family that only seasoned their food with salt and pepper. It was the only thing that they ever used on their food. And then you visit a friend's house and you find out, well, they also use cilantro and basil and oregano and different kinds of hot peppers. And you think, gosh, We never use that. Are we allowed to use that? And you think, well, there's more freedom than I ever realized I had. There's more spices that can be used in good cooking. My parents aren't bad because they don't like spicy food. That's just the kind of food they like. That's what they're used to. I can't expect them to change, but it doesn't mean that I have to stay with only two spices being allowed. And when you learn about the diversity of Christian history, that Christians in different times have had very different understandings and interpretations, and you understand that in different denominations and cultures and sectors of Christianity, there's a great variety. I think it helps us to say that that Christian faith was never intended to only be one version, but that diversity is one of the ways that living things evolve and develop. So I think we find we have freedom, not freedom to do just whatever we want. Again, the Apostle Paul saw this in the New Testament. He said, Christ set you free. There's freedom is God's purpose. Don't use your freedom as an opportunity to do evil and unhelpful things. Uh, Use your freedom to serve one another in love. And that to me is that where that fourth stage of harmony takes us, to use our freedom, enjoy our freedom, but to enjoy it to serve one another in love.
I think you've put it quite well, Brian. Because many people don't maybe realize that when you exist, or you as a Christian, you particularly engage in different faith traditions that come with beauty as well, that that has been passed down from generations to generations. And we don't have just one Christianity, but we have Christianities in the plural. And
Yes.
that is very helpful, because you also touch on it in Faith After Doubt, and you offer this vision of faith that is very expansive and
Yes.
inclusive. And how does that vision challenge that traditional religious paradigm that many may find themselves in? And what do you believe are the benefits of embracing this more inclusive approach to spirituality?
Well, if we take seriously these pivotal statements, like from the Hebrew scriptures, when the prophet Micah says, "What does God desire of you?" And the answer is to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. And you find yourself in a Christian uh, sort of movement or denomination or church or theology that is not making you seek justice. It's only making you seek correctness over everyone else. And it's not making you love kindness. It's only making you love being right and proving everybody else wrong. And it's not making you walk humbly with God. It's making you walk arrogantly with other people. You say, something's wrong here. This isn't working. Or you read Jesus saying, what matters most is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbors yourself. And you say, this form of religion that I'm practicing, I'm being cruel to people. I'm being harmful to people. Or you read Paul say, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. The only thing that matters is faith expressing itself in love. So to me, the real goal is that we move in this direction of deepening our capacity to love for our neighbor, love for the stranger, the outsider, the outcast, even the enemy, love for ourselves, and I think increasingly importantly, love for the earth and our fellow creatures. So to live with love is the benefit of moving beyond simplicity and moving toward maturity. So interesting. In one of the most famous passages of the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, look, I used to be very immature. I was very childish. I thought the way a child thinks. But when I became more mature, I moved to see that love is the most important thing.
That's so key, Brian. Um, because we see this in the teaching of Jesus, and Paul probably gets it later on in life in his writing,
Yes.
and we think about it as he put it on. But now our time is running out, so I just want to throw in one or two questions before I let you go. Um, this book has been intriguing to me, and I certainly believe that it's been intriguing to many of our readers. these two books specifically, Do I Stay Christian and Faith After Doubt. What is that hope that you ultimately want readers to take away from this book in terms of their experience, and what
Yes.
transformation or insight do you hope your books will inspire in the lives of those
Yes.
who are reading them?
Well, in Faith After Doubt, I hope that people will understand that faith is a journey. It's not a little locked room that you're stuck in. It's a pathway. Jesus said, "Follow me," not sit in this room and never have another idea or thought. And in Do I Stay Christian? Here's a way I would say it. If you're going to stay Christian, be aware of the ways that that Christianity has been used to harm both Christians and non-Christians and the earth itself. And so say yes to staying Christian, but say no to those forms and expressions of Christianity that have been harmful. And if you say no, I don't want to stay Christian, be sure to look in Christian faith and see what the treasures are. Do you want to stay with loving your neighbor as yourself? To not throw away everything, but to try to keep the treasures with you. Uh, those are some of the things that I would hope would come from these books.
That's interesting, and thank you so much, Brian, for that, because it's so helpful. I mean, at least to me, what has helped me in the past is employing the Jesus lens in terms of how I
Yes.
approach the treatment towards my fellow human beings. So if it
Yes.
doesn't promote the well-being of my fellow neighbor, I pretty much discard that, because it's not very productive in how I
Yes.
move on in my Christian journey and faith. I certainly have learned a lot from your books, and I believe our audience will learn a lot from your books particularly. Tell me now, Brian, before I let you go. I know you're probably doing something in the pipeline that working on, and you probably may want our audience to get their hands on some of the work that you are doing. Is there something in the pipeline that you're working on?
Yes. So my newest book that will come out in May of this year, 2024, is a book called Life After Doom. And the subtitle is Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. And I wrote this book especially for people who look at what's going on in our world and are very, very concerned. They see our climate and ecological crisis. They see wealth being funneled to a smaller and smaller group of billionaires who use their power to gain more power and use their wealth to gain more wealth. And then also we look around and see a movement toward authoritarian leaders in many countries around the world, including my own. And we're very disturbed that the gains we've made of equal human rights and democracy could be rolled back by people desperate for a strongman type leader. And we look and we feel very, very discouraged and very afraid. And I use the word doom. We feel a sense of doom come over us. And so this book is really written to help people find a productive and constructive way of responding to that feeling that the world seems to be falling apart in so many ways.
That sounds like a good read. So I'm waiting in anticipation to get my hands on it.
Oh, thanks, Cliff.
Yeah. Brian, it had certainly been great having you on the show, as usual now, because you're now a regular, and we certainly hope we'll have you again on the book to talk about some of the insights that you bring into that new book you're working on. Thank you so much, and I hope our listeners at home have enjoyed and learned a lot from our conversation. Thank you very much, and stay blessed.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.